in Mariupol, where hundreds of people are sheltering. Ukrainian officials say they're still in contact with troops who are defending the site. Elsewhere, the European Union's been accused of acting too late over plans to ban all Russian imports of oil by the end of the year. The bloc is hitting Vladimir Putin, though, with more sanctions. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says Russia's offensive can only last for so long.
Alliances mean security. If you look at history where countries predominantly lost, it was when they didn't have friends and allies. And the stronger we are in our integration, the stronger we are in our defence.
Shop prices are now rising at their fastest pace in a decade. The figures from the British Retail Consortium have prompted yet more calls for the government to step in to help struggling families with the cost of living crisis. Wayne Couzens' lawyers told the Court of Appeal the former Met police officer deserves decades in jail for the murder of Sarah Everard, but he's claimed the whole life term handed down was excessive. Judges are now reviewing it. Transport for London's confirmed the new Elizabeth line will open on the 24th of May. Crosswell was meant to be completed in 2018. LBC Markets report the FTSE 100's closed down 68 points at 74.93. The pound buys $1.25 and €1.19. LBC weather, those showers clearing, particularly in the southeast tonight. Cloudy and damp, though, with a low of 6. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:02 on LBC. Welcome to Cross Question. Now, if you're watching on Global Player, you might be eagle-eyed enough to see 2 blank spaces around this table. There's been an accident in central London which has held up Sir Vince Cable and Denise Headley, but they will be here imminently. But while they are making their way to the studio, we're going to hear from Emily Sheffield. She is a former editor of the London Evening Standard. We'll find out what she's doing now in a moment. We've also got Steve Cannane with us, Europe Bureau Chief for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, in London. They are here to take your calls. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. And as I say, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, before we come to your calls, I think I'm just going to have a little gossip with Steve and Emily about sort of what they're up to at the moment. Steve, let's start with you, because it must be a fascinating time to be doing your job in London, but it would also be a very fascinating time in Australia at the moment because you've got an election going on.
We do. We have an election in about 2.5 weeks' time. But yes, what a time to be in Europe, because we cover all of Europe for the ABC here. So we obviously have people deployed in Ukraine at the moment. I'm probably going there next week.
Oh, are you? God, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I was covering the French election a couple of weeks ago, so...
I kind of want your job.
It is truly one of the most amazing jobs. They flog us, but you go to amazing places and you never know quite where you're going to end up. I remember one time taking my daughter to football in London. This was back in about 2016, 2017. And I was told, you've got to get on the next plane to Barcelona. They're beating up voters, and it was the independence referendum, and I came back 10 or 11 days later. So your job can be like that, where you are suddenly taken to somewhere and you know nothing about a story and you have to catch up very fast.
Emily, you edited the London Evening Standard, a very difficult time going through the pandemic. I mean, being an editor of it's not a national newspaper, but most of Westminster thinks it is. I mean, that must have been quite an experience.
It was a huge experience. I was there for 17 months. I went in after just after the
George Osborne.
I took it from George Osborne, and I went in after the first lockdown, and had to go in and make horrendous cuts, completely restructure the company, turn it digital facing, and we had a plan, but the plan had been made before the pandemic hit, and we just kept getting hit again and again after each. And our revenue just tumbling. And it was a very difficult time, but it was also a very exciting time because you're there at the absolute sort of middle of the epidemic, which was in London, and you really feel like it was your duty. We were still delivering the paper. We went home delivery. Yeah. So it was unbelievably exciting because as a reporter, as you know, journalists, you want to report on big events. And this, let's face it, this is probably the biggest event of our whole lifestyle. I mean, I know Ukraine is huge, but this was something that was totally global and the whole world had shut down. So to be in the middle of that was probably one of the most exciting things I'll ever do.
Oh, don't write off the rest of your life.
No, I'm not. Do you know what? I'm doing a lot with LBC at the moment and Talk TV, and broadcasting's a new thing for me, and I'm absolutely loving it.
Don't mention that.
Oh, sorry.
It was also a story that impacted everybody's life as well, and in unique ways.
Yeah. We are delighted to be joined by Sir Vince Cable. Welcome, Vince. I think it's time we went to our first question. It's from Chris in London. Chris, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, good evening, panel. Is council tax the only thing that should matter when people come to vote in local elections tomorrow in England?
Well, that indicates that you think it ought to be. Why do you think that?
I don't, actually, to be honest with you.
You don't? All right. Why would you ask the question then?
Well, no, I'm just to see what others think. I think for me, it's 50% of it, because I've got a child with special needs, and I know the impact of cuts to public services. And I've got other children I know who are going through real struggles to get the support they need. But I also think this is about Boris Johnson and a frankly shameful government that doesn't abide by its own rules.
OK. So the question is, do you think council tax will be the main issue for voters tomorrow? Emily?
I think it's... Chris, I think it's a lot of the things that you just mentioned, actually. I think there's going to be a proportion of voters, possibly Tory voters, actually, who probably won't even come out to vote because they are not feeling very happy with Boris Johnson. They voted him in and they got Brexit done, but I'm not sure they've really seen any of the benefits from Brexit yet. They're struggling probably with cost of living, feeling part of the squeezed middle, and not feeling particularly excited that their leader has been particularly truthful with them over these past months. I think for other people, it's really going to come down to the cost of living crisis and looking at how each party is saying they're going to help them. Now, the Tories were out today saying, we've done enough. We heard George Eustice, the Environment Minister, telling people, well, you just need to go and, shop a bit more cleverly down the supermarket. But I suspect, depending on where you are in terms of wealth, is you're going to be looking more to local councillors and not voting maybe on local issues about who's going to help you more, because you're really, like Elsie, who's having to ride around on a bus, you're literally worried about making your fuel bills. So
what I don't understand is when Boris Johnson had a disastrous interview with Susanna Reid on the cost of living crisis and Elsie, why on earth would you send George Eustice out the next day to basically rub it in? Because there are ministers who are capable of empathising. George Eustice is not one of them.
Well, I'd like to be slightly generous to George in that I don't think it's not that he doesn't empathise.
Well, he's not
with
capable
Elsie,
of showing it then.
But what I've seen consistently with the Tory party, and this was definitely true through the pandemic, is you get Boris Johnson saying one thing, and then you get a minister going out on the airwaves the next day and saying something completely different. So Boris Johnson said, no, we are going to do more for you. And then you've got George Eustice going out the next day defending what they've already done and saying, no, we've done enough. It's up to you to worry about.
Would never have happened in your day, would it, Vince?
I think not, no. But, council tax is part of the cost of living and absolutely critical. And what governments do, and this government's doing, is in order to squeeze public spending, they cut support for local government, the council tax goes up. I mean, it used to be a barometer of local government performance, but no longer. Education's been taken out of it. But it is part of the cost of living. It's a regressive tax in relation to people's income. It's not even proportional. It's part of the kind of dissatisfaction about rising costs and inflation, which is getting to people.
Council tax, it always used to be really the main issue in local elections, didn't it? Yeah. But it doesn't seem to be anymore, even though it's higher than it's ever been.
Well, I think once education was taken out of it, the contribution of local government to council tax bills is diminished. Boroughs like mine, we don't get any central government support, so council tax is a reasonable barometer of how the council's performing. But in many parts of the country, it's not. I haven't heard very much discussion about it, and in a way, it's good that this question has brought it to light. Yeah.
Denise Headley has joined us. I'm not going to come to you next, Denise, because you don't even know what the question is, but I'll tell you in a second. In fact, I'll tell you now. Do you think council tax will be the main issue for voters tomorrow? Steve?
I don't think so. I think voters vote for a myriad of reasons, sometimes purely tribalism, quite often because they want to punish one individual or one party over the other. I suspect that may trump council tax, but as Vince points out, council tax is part of cost of living at the moment, and I think that is at front and centre of people's minds. But I think also in local elections, people look at services as well, and if their services are up to scratch, well, they may vote in favour of that council, or they may vote against them if they're not up to scratch. So I think it's an element, but I don't think it's the main one.
How does it work in Australia with local taxation and local councils?
Well, we have 3 levels of government, would you believe? We have more politicians per head of population than probably any nation on earth. We have local elections, state elections, federal elections.
Fantastic. Think of all those election
you would
nights.
love it, Ian.
I would.
Come there one time again, but yeah, so there is local council taxes, there's also state taxes, there's also federal taxes. So, but local elections in Australia are predominantly about whether your garbage gets collected or not.
Now, Denise, you have been a local councillor for 2 different parties. First Labour, then Conservative. Tell us about your memories of local elections, and were you sometimes frustrated that voters in your ward were not voting on your qualities or your opponent's qualities, they were voting on national issues?
I think it depends very much on what the local conversation is, because when I was a councillor, the key was getting out the 1,500 votes, because if you can get 1,500 votes, you're likely to actually be given an opportunity to serve. But you do get conversations in relation to what's happening with the local party as opposed to what's happening with the national party, and you spend quite a lot of time on the stump explaining that you are the local representative, so you could do something about bins, you could do something about your local school if there was a governing issue, but you didn't have the opportunity to do things nationally, and I think that's what a lot of people...
And you didn't party?
Well, no.
Well, you probably did, but...
No, one doesn't do that, Ian.
I don't mean during the pandemic. I mean when you were running.
Labour didn't do social events, only the Conservatives. That's one of the reasons I joined them.
So, in terms of what's happening now, and do you think that, as Chris is suggesting, that council tax will be one of the main issues for voters tomorrow? I don't think he's necessarily on the money there.
I think the cost of living increase is going to be a wider issue. I also think people's perception of the National Party, and it might be their opportunity to effectively give the government a kicking. So I think you're going to have people voting for a myriad of reasons, national and local. But council tax will be a particular issue. I think it will happen more so now that the bills are hitting people's mats in conjunction with food prices.
Chris, let's come back to you.
Well, on the subject of council tax, I have found it interesting that certain Tory campaigns in Wandsworth and Richmond and other places have been focusing on freezing council tax. That's great, but with 8% inflation, what services are they going to cut? And that's what I find interesting, is they're talking about, protecting the cost of living at the same time as a national insurance rise. And it's the same with, pushing responsibility, as Vince talked about, onto local councils for social care and other matters. And they think that people are stupid. And I'm afraid to say that I'm certainly not. And I think lots of people know how these things work.
OK, Chris, thanks for your call. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment on any subject you like. Can be about the local elections or whatever you're particularly interested in. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's coming up to 8:15.
LBC's Election Night Live with Iain Dale. Follow the results tomorrow evening from 10. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 16 minutes past 8 on LBC. You're listening to or watching Cross Question on Global Player. Vince Cable is with us. Emily Sheffield, former editor of the Evening Standard. Steve Cannane is here, Europe Bureau Chief for the ABC. And Denise Headley is here too. She needs no introduction, does she? Right, let's go to Shahid in Hemel Hempstead. Hello, Shahid.
Yeah, hi. My question to the panel is, if someone considers none of the candidates on a ballot paper or the political parties good enough to be given their vote, and that person refuses to vote for any candidate, who would you blame more, the person for not voting or the candidates and political parties for not being good enough in an individual person's eyes for not voting for them?
Do you not think, Shahid, it's probably more a national thing if somebody doesn't want to vote?
Yeah, I would go along with that because there's no elections tomorrow in my area. There's going to be next year, and I'll probably only because I was a former member of the Labour Party, I probably would on that basis give my vote maybe to some of my local or former comrades. But a lot of them have moved on for various reasons. They've retired or moved out of the area, all that kind of stuff. But I took issue from about an hour ago. You had a caller who said that people fought and died for the right to vote. I don't think they did. In World War I, we went to war because of what the German Kaiser was doing in Europe in reaction to the death of Franz Ferdinand, and 80% of the people did not have the right to vote. The right to vote came along around about.
Well, they certainly did in World War II, and if we'd lost World War II, we'd be speaking German, and we probably wouldn't be voting. Vince Cable, let's start with you. I think for most politicians, one of the most frustrating things is when you knock on someone's door in a rather superior way. They say, "Oh, I don't vote."
Yeah, it is very frustrating, and I think preaching at people saying it's your civic duty doesn't really wash it. I mean, I think particularly in local elections, where we're talking about 50% average, my area's Richmond is very civic conscious, it gets up to 60 plus.
But in local elections?
Yeah,
really?
Sometimes in other areas it's down to 20, 30. Now, the question is, why is that? I think one reason is that government in Britain has become horribly centralised, more than any other country in Europe. I mean, most local government services are now effectively dictated by central government. So people feel, well, what's the point of local government? And the other is, and you expect me as a Lib Dem to say this, but, the voting system doesn't help. If you have a first-past-the-post system, there are large numbers of wards and, of course, constituencies in general election where your vote doesn't really count because it's heavily polarised in one direction or the other. That's
because more people vote for that party.
That's
surely
right.
Every vote counts equally.
It does, but if you have the Scottish system, they now have proportional representation in local government, and it's done a lot actually to reactivate life in local government. It used to be one-party states, as many of our cities are here, but now every city has a coalition of some kind. Your vote does make a real difference in a way that it doesn't in our first-past-the-post system.
Let's widen it out a bit. Do you think we should copy Australia and have compulsory voting?
I don't. I think it is perfectly valid. In certain circumstances, people just say, well, I don't want to vote or I want to spoil my ballot, but they can do that on the Australian system. No, I think opting out is a perfectly legitimate expression of your political views. I mean, I'd like people to vote, but I think the Australian model isn't what I would go for.
Steve?
Well, if I can speak in defence of the Australian model, I actually think it works. And one of the good things about it is you have a contest for the centre. So you are not having a situation like in the US where you're trying to get people out to vote by pushing buttons around abortion and gun control and issues like that. You instead have an assumption that everyone's going to turn up to vote, and elections tend to be won in the centre. So you don't have these extreme policies that people are hitting hot button issues on like you see in the US. On the point of who's to blame that the caller brought up, well, I think it's a bit of both, and I do actually think people need to take individual responsibility. Voting, to live in a country that has voting is a privilege, and you should not give that privilege away. I mean, look at countries like Russia at the moment, where if you are an opposition leader like Alexei Navalny, you can't get on the ballot paper, or what happened to Boris Nemtsov when he was assassinated, he couldn't get on the ballot paper. Look at what happened in South Africa post-apartheid, what that meant to the people who'd been denied a vote. It is so important to vote. And I can understand that people think the stakes aren't high in a local council election, but federal and general elections are incredibly important. In France, we just saw the lowest turnout since 1969, 72% voted, which is still relatively
That's
high.
quite high. I mean, here, what was the last election here? It wasn't that high, was it?
We were just looking it up in the control room.
63.
It was around 67.
I was 67.
Was it 67, I think, percent? So that was their lowest in over 50 years. And that was because a lot of people, particularly on the left, didn't want to vote for Macron or Le Pen. So, look, I just think it's incredibly important to vote. And even if you have to hold your nose and vote for the least worst option, it's a privilege and it's important.
And all you have to do, and I hear what you say, Vince, about not wanting to preach on the doorstep, but I think you should preach on the doorstep a bit and say, hang on a minute, do you remember in 1994 those queues outside the polling stations in South Africa in the first post-apartheid election? That's what it means. When Iraqis went to vote for the first time, that's what democracy is all about, and we just take it for granted.
Well, the government in many ways is taking us in the opposite direction. There's demand for ID, for example. There's, a lot of people are very mobile, they don't have documentation, there's very little fraud. So, why were things like that introduced? I mean, it's actually discouraging voting.
Denise?
I think the point about having people to have ID is a really important one, because that's going to remove a lot of marginalised people who are transient in particular areas, or people who can't meet certain conditions. So I think that's a really important point. But in relation to what is the reason for low turnout, I think it's twofold. One, it's to do with the candidate's ability to fund their campaign. I've been a councillor. I know what it takes. It takes cash money and it takes foot soldiers. And if you cannot provide foot soldiers and cash money, you are not getting out your messages and getting out. So often what happens, you see the moneyed clients being selected because they can fund a campaign. So that then means that your local residents who don't have cash money, they don't get in. So then people feel sometimes there's a disconnect. And I think that's part of the reason why you get low turnout, because people feel that there's a disconnect between what they're hoping for locally and what they often get. The other point in relation to who's to blame is also the candidates. You need a candidate who is able to mobilise, who is able to make people exciting, like I was when I was campaigning. Henceforth,
I can imagine.
I was fabulous, if I say so myself. But essentially, the point I'm making is that you need a candidate that's got a bit of vroom about them, so that even if you're not getting that, you don't have the money, you can get people to support you, like your local radio station or your local paper will run something for you. So you need to have a number of qualities.
Emily?
I think on candidates, I mean, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. I've got unbelievably good local councillors, and one of them, she actually just passed away, and she was Lib Dem and she swapped over to the Tories. I turned up for every local election. I'll be turning up tomorrow, because my local councillors actually really worked unbelievably hard on the things that made a difference to my life day in, day out. Fly tipping at the end of my street, rubbish not being picked up.
You really must stop doing that.
What?
Fly tipping.
Sorry. I was like, what am I doing? And so I do think the candidates do matter, actually. I take all the points that you're saying, but actually there were plenty. I remember going out and canvassing with our local candidates, and honestly, I wouldn't have cared whether they were Tory, Lib Dem or Labour. I just cared that they worked really hard for the community, and they a lot of them are doing it for free or practically no money. So I think the candidates do matter, and it's about getting on the radio or having foot soldiers, but actually I really think it's about doing. If I sent an email, my local councillors got back to me and sorted it out, and I think it's going to be a real shame tomorrow if a bunch of good, strong local councillors get booted out because either people stay at home and don't come and vote at all, or because people are going to vote on national issues and ignore the fact that their local councillors are getting up day in, day out and working, well, we hope, are working day in, day out incredibly hard for them.
Denise, when you were a councillor, how much time did it take to be a councillor?
Okay, so being a local councillor invariably suits mature people who are retired, because you can't do it if you are someone like myself at the time. I was a single mum and I was working, so I had to do it in the evening, and you have to work in the night. You sit on scrutiny, you sit on working groups, you attend your local surgeries, you might attend local area forums, and it takes a lot of time. And councillors are paid, but they're paid a very small amount of money, so you can't live on on the salary, so you have to have another job. So the amount of time you can invest is reduced if you are of a certain age. But then you also have to understand how the local council works itself. So you raise a members' inquiry, like which was being said. But if you're in opposition, it's very difficult for you to get things done because you're not controlling the budget.
And also, if you live in a rural area, a lot of councils still hold meetings during the daytime, which precludes working people from ever becoming councillors. It's all geared towards people who are retired. Shahid, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's go to a text from Terry in Basildon, who says, in the light of the war in Ukraine, does the panel think NATO expansion is to blame, and should Britain leave the alliance? Well, Steve, you're off to Ukraine, you said, in a couple of weeks' time. This whole question of NATO membership does seem to be a live one.
So that's Terry, is it?
Yeah.
Texting. So I'm wondering what he means by NATO expansion. Is he talking about back to 1997? Is he talking about that they were considering allowing Ukraine and Georgia to join? I think Russia, if you look at what Putin's essay, his 5,000-word essay was, he wrote about 6 to 9 months before the invasion. There was a myriad of reasons why he wanted to take control of Ukraine and to invade Ukraine. And yes, he's been infuriated by NATO expansion post the fall of the Berlin Wall and those Eastern European countries, some of which were part of the Soviet Union, joining NATO. But they had an independent choice as sovereign nations to join NATO. So do you want to blame them for taking that choice?
And there was a reason that they wanted to join NATO.
There was a reason. And there's a reason now why Sweden and Finland are considering joining NATO. So, look, I just think it's up to an individual nation's choice. And yes, it's upset Russia. And yes, you can have a historical argument about how the West may have rubbed Russia's nose in it post the collapse of the Soviet Union. But look, those countries made their choice.
Denise.
Well, I'm going to tread carefully here. I don't think...
First.
I will try. I don't think that... I do think that NATO expansion has definitely played a feature in the way in which the Russian regime has responded in terms of what they perceived as their red lines that were being crossed. But you can't argue with the fact that Russia has invaded the Ukraine, and therefore should Britain leave the alliance? I don't necessarily know if that would be a good idea at this point. It might be something to consider at a later date.
Well, because that, of course, is the Green Party's new policy. We want to leave NATO, but only after the Ukraine war is over. And you think, is there a more ludicrous policy ever announced by a political party?
I think that the question about, you have to ask yourself, what was NATO set up to do? NATO was set up to stop Russian expansion. When Russia actually collapsed in 1991, the question as to whether or not NATO should have done the same is for me a question that we didn't really pay much attention to. But now my position on the war is that by continuing to support the intervention of the Ukrainian army with more and more weapons, I think we are prolonging the conflict. And there, to me, seems to be a real lack of statesmanship, or statespersonship, should I say, in terms of trying to bring this conflict to an end. And that's
hang on
my
a
worry.
minute. Yeah. So basically, the way that you would suggest to bring this conflict to an end is to let Russia win.
I think
that's the natural conclusion of what you just said.
The difficulty that we've got is that Russia is a huge military power. And my view is, how are we going to find a way out of it? There has to be a diplomatic solution. So where are we going to begin to have that conversation? So I don't know. I'm not the person to give all of the views, but my worry right now is the only thing that's really happening is that more and more Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians and ordinary-speaking Ukrainians, their blood is being spilled, and we're doing this from afar.
But well, no, we're not. The Ukrainian army are doing it, and the Ukrainians are very grateful, particularly to Britain, for the amount of help that we've given them.
I agree, but then how are we going to stop it, though, Iain? We can't just leave it.
By helping them defeat Russia.
I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, you look at the Russians in Donbass at the moment. They've made very little progress.
Okay, but this war didn't begin in 8 or 9 weeks ago. It began in 2014. It's been going for some time.
We agree on that.
It's been going for some time. I'm saying there has to be a diplomatic solution. That would be my answer.
We're going to come to Emily and Vince in just a few moments' time. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30 on LBC. News headlines with Serena Farrow.
The reports of fighting at a steel plant in Mariupol as Russian forces have broken into the site. Hundreds of people are still sheltering there, although there have been some evacuations in recent days. Boris Johnson's admitted the country's going through a tough patch as the cost of living rises. Figures from the British Retail Consortium show costs within shops have risen at the highest rate in a decade. And Transport for London's confirmed the new Elizabeth line will now open on the 24th of May. Crossrail, though, was meant to be completed in 2018. LBC weather, showers clearing, particularly in the southeast tonight. Cloudy and damp in the far northwest with a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:32. Welcome back to Cross Question. With me in the studio, as you can see if you're watching on Global Player, we have the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, former editor of the Evening Standard, Emily Sheffield, Steve Cannane, who's Europe Bureau Chief for the ABC, that's the Australian one, not the American one, and Denise Headley is here too, and making quite an impact, if I may say so, Denise. Right, let's go to the next question. It is from Terry. Actually, we've got to finish off Terry's question, haven't we? Because we haven't heard from Emily and Vince yet. His question, just to remind you, in the light of the war in Ukraine, does the panel think NATO expansion is to blame, and should Britain leave the alliance? Vince?
Well, Britain certainly shouldn't. I mean, one of the things this war has done is to breathe new life into NATO. It was almost destroyed by Trump primarily. We may get him back and he may try the same routine, but I don't think so. There is now a real spirit on both sides of the Atlantic to make it work. The Americans have done a very strong job. They've stepped up to the plate, as we have, and we've now got new countries wanting to join. I think Finland almost certainly will, Sweden more doubtfully. But no, it's breathed life into it, and it's underlined just how important it is. I think with the case of Ukraine, they've got to decide themselves as a sovereign country, and that's what they're fighting for. Zelensky has said he wants Ukraine to be neutral, but that's the choice they have to make. So it has strengthened NATO. So I think a bigger question in many ways, or a separate question, is whether Ukraine will also join the European Union, and whether that should be expedited, and whether that will shift the centre of gravity economically in Europe.
Have you been surprised at the relative unity of NATO so far?
Yes, it has, impressively so. I mean, the French always were a bit different, but they're playing their role. The Germans, I know people are criticising them for foot dragging on certain types of armaments, but actually they've made a major contribution, and they are nearly in the front line, and they've got more at stake. So yeah, it has been an impressive show of unity, and I'm pleased that the British have played their role in it.
Emily?
I'm afraid to disagree with Denise quite strongly, actually, is that I think that this NATO expansion is to blame for Russia invading Ukraine. It's a complete red herring. I don't think NATO expansion, I think it's been absolutely used as an excuse by Putin and his supporters to explain why they have invaded the Ukraine and why they have invaded Crimea. If you look back to that big speech that did he write or
he wrote
it,
5,000
right?
word essay. Yeah.
It's talking about the reinstatement of the sort of Russia as this big power. So he's going back back to imperial times when the royal family were still in Russia, and he's talking about this great, big, powerful country. So I just don't think NATO's got anything to do with it. It's just an excuse. And should Britain leave the alliance? Definitely not. I mean, to follow on what Vince has said, we've actually just seen how important NATO is. Russia has invaded Ukraine. We don't know where it's going to go next. We don't know if
we do. Moldova.
Well, Moldova, maybe, or maybe at the moment, it doesn't look like he's winning. So I think Ukraine, with our support, I do think this war's going to go on for a long time. But why would we want to leave an alliance which has just absolutely proved its worth in holding the barricades against a leader of a very, very, very large country?
Well, Denise is a part
with a
of
very
the agreement,
large.
so I don't think anybody's seriously suggesting.
He's attacked them. He's just bombed a theatre back in March, killing 600 civilians.
What about Denise's point, though, that in the end, this is going to have to come to an end, and the longer the West provides military hardware to assist Ukraine, the longer that will prolong the conflict. And Russia, I mean, I'm slightly putting words into your mouth here, but Russia's victory is inevitable in the end.
I think we've seen, and I'm afraid, Denise, I think we all wish that we could end this conflict, particularly the Ukrainians who are actually dying in their thousands. I'm sure there's quite a few Russians who, if they were given the right information, don't want their sons going off and dying there anymore. But he's not going to talk. Putin is a liar. He's proved himself a liar time and time again. They tried to bring everyone to the table, and he carried on lying. They sent, civilian convoys in to get the civilians out. He sent his army in to kill them as they were trying to leave in those safe passages. Every single leader who has ever dealt with Putin says he is a liar. You cannot, I don't think, negotiate with someone like that.
We could get on to liars, couldn't we? But let's move on. John is in Feltham. John, what would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask that given the Roe and Wade US court might struck it down, and in the southern states the voting rights are being curtailed, is America going backwards?
So this is the Roe versus Wade judgment by the American Supreme Court in 1973, which effectively legalised abortion throughout the United States. It's been a massive bone of contention on both sides of the argument ever since. And it's one of those issues that we don't quite understand why it's such a big issue in America. We're going to be talking about this much more after 9 o'clock on the programme. But in a sense, I suppose you've got to ask, if the Supreme Court does what it is threatening to do, it seems, can America still describe itself as the land of the free? I think that's quite a good little addendum to put to John's question here. Denise, let's start with you.
I think America has rolled back, or the potential for it to be rolled back is significant for women's rights and women's ability to control their own fertility. And I'm quite saddened that it's become another one of these political buttons that we were referring to earlier, which people press to, which make people very emotive. And I think it's a sad day for especially women who come from marginalised communities and women whose access to healthcare is precluded by cost. So this is going to disproportionately affect Indigenous women, women of African and African descent, and women from communities like the Hispanic community. So I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's an assault on women's choice, and I think it's a retrograde step for America.
Steve, is this a live issue in Australia?
No, not at all. I don't think it's I mean, we had an abortion referendum in Ireland in 2018 that 66% of a country that was virtually 95% Catholic overturned that. It's not really an issue in Western democracies. It is a massive backward step. It's interesting, isn't it, that you have all these people in those southern states who believe in individual rights when it comes to gun ownership, but not abortion. And look, women are why aren't women making these decisions? Why are judges making these decisions? And a woman has a right to make a decision about her body and whether she is in a position to bring a child into this world or not. And if they believe in individual rights, they should hand that right over to those women.
Emily.
I was doing quite a bit of research on this. So I thought the Times actually had... Am I allowed to mention the Times?
Of course you're allowed to
Not
mention
Talk
the
TV.
Times.
They had quite an interesting leader on this. First, I just want to say, Denise, I agree with Denise 100%. I think this isn't... If this happens in 2 months' time, it's like an abomination. It's going to kill and subjugate women, particularly women from lower-income families. And you've got apparently 13 states are ready to trigger it, and 26 states have already said they're going to ban abortion, but 69% of Americans say they don't want abortion banned. So this is an extraordinary thing that has been happening for the last
you would
decade.
think, therefore, that the politicians behind this, and OK, it's a legal decision, but let's not pretend it is politicians that are behind this.
Yeah.
You would think that those politicians would then get punished in the ballot box, wouldn't you?
Well, funny enough, that is what Biden has said. So he said two things, Biden. He has said he is going to fight for a woman's right to abortion, and the way he's going to do that is codify the right to abortion into federal law, because Roe versus Wade was a judicial case, sort of overstretching the law. He's also said, you've got the midterms coming up in November, is that right?
Yeah.
This November. So he's saying if you're pro-choice, then vote against this. Vote against your state governor. If they're pro-banning it, and we're talking about 22 states who are going to move to ban it, then yes, use your vote. I mean, just goes back to local elections. Don't sit at home and moan.
Yeah.
Get out and vote. And I hope there's going to be a big, and Denise, you might know this more, there's going to be a big pro-abortion movement to get people out to vote, especially from maybe lower income or marginalised societies who maybe wouldn't normally go out and vote. And I hope they really get that going for the midterms, because I think this is going to be absolutely horrifying. But what we do also hope, and the Times leader had an interesting point, that while Roe versus Wade and the right to have an abortion was always sort of more of a judicial law rather than federal law, what Biden's saying is that he's going to codify the right to abortion into federal law. Now, that would actually make it safe. It would be like our law to ban abortion. Sorry, ban abortion. Sorry, not ban abortion. Allow abortion, which we took place here in Westminster in 1967.
Apart from in Northern Ireland. But of course, what the current government has done in Northern Ireland is effectively done what Joe Biden is saying, because they say, well, look, the Northern Ireland Assembly is never going to vote for this, so we are going to do it ourselves in London.
Yeah.
And that has now happened.
Yeah. But what you want to happen is for this to happen, you want him to codify it in federal law, but what we were discussing earlier is, will he get that through Congress?
Well, on that bombshell, Vince Cable.
Yes, I mean, we're all in agreement here. It's boring in a sense, but I think we all agree it's a terrible step back for women's rights, and particularly for low-income groups as well. And the question now is what happens, and as you've spelled out, one of the options, that they pass a federal law to overturn this. The other, which is, I think, what Roosevelt did, which is actually to pack the Supreme Court to create more justices from his own party and simply shift the balance again. But, you know, either of those two things...
That would be a bad thing.
It would be a bad thing, but it's, you know, given that American politics is now so horribly polarised, this is the kind of thing could happen. And I worry, actually. I mean, America is the standard bearer for Western democracy, and it's in bad shape. I mean, they came perilously close to civil war or violence with the storming of the Capitol, and this is the kind of very, very bitterly divisive issue that will ramp up the emotions again. And with Trump coming back, you know, the outlook is not good at all.
Yeah, and because the reason the Supreme Court have managed to do this is because Trump managed to get the judicial balance to 6 conservative versus 3 liberal. He has done exactly what.
But all presidents have done that. All presidents have selected Supreme Court justices that reflect theirs or their own party's views. There's nothing wrong in him doing that. Constitutionally, anyway.
Well, the American that's assuming you believe that the politicisation of the judiciary is okay.
Yeah.
No, but the judges that he appointed, I mean, they were all sort of people with good judicial reputations, weren't they?
Well, there was some challenge before Congress. I think was it Brett Kavanaugh got quite a grilling, and some people were suggesting he didn't have the judicial heft to be a Supreme Court judge. And also, let's not forget that the Democrats put forward a nominee for the Supreme Court who was knocked back against by the Republicans just before the election.
Well, of course they would be, but that the same thing has happened the other way round when there's been sort of different presidents.
Of course. But look, I think the heart of the problem is the politicisation of the judiciary. I mean, this doesn't happen in normal countries to this degree, where you are putting extremists on a court who have a very strong view. And, Trump, let's face it, did this so he could get Roe versus Wade overturned.
You see, I'm not sure that's the truth, because if you look at Trump's history on women's rights and abortion rights, he used to be very pro-choice.
Yeah, but
it changed.
But that's
it changed because he knew it was a vote
goes
winner.
whatever way he would get votes.
I'm not defending Trump, but he has never been a down the line Republican.
No, I mean, look at him in the New York nightclubs of the 1980s.
I'd rather not.
He is not the kind of person, who his views are inconsistent, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So look, he was trying to get the evangelical vote, and that's why he did it.
Yeah, and he was successful in doing so. John, thank you for that question. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. And just before we go to break, let me remind you, we have LBC's Election Night live programme tomorrow from 10 o'clock. I'll be co-hosting with Jackie Smith for 8 hours. Yes, you did hear that right. It'll be, if you listen to our For the Many podcast, I can assure you that during the course of the night, it's going to become very for the many. Those of you listen will know exactly what that means. It's 8:46.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
There does seem to be new evidence gaining ground concerning what might have gone on in Old Durham town when the leader of the Labour Party was there, Janine Hammersmith. The police re-investigated at number 10. They should re-investigate what happened at Durham.
Why?
No, please don't answer with a question. Why shouldn't they?
I'll answer it. Dominic Cummings. Why aren't they re-investigating him?
No, you see, you answered another question.
You don't like Labour. End of.
Ridiculous.
No.
If I didn't quote like Labour, why do you suppose Sir Keir comes in the studio every month?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 10 to 9. Vince Cable, Emily Sheffield, Steve Cannane and Denise Headley with us taking your calls. I'm going to ask them all to be relatively brief in their answers for the remaining part of the programme, because then we can get more questions in. Jamie is in York. Hello, Jamie. Oh, no, Jamie's a text. It says, a Cambridge Vice-Chancellor has said that private schools must accept they will get fewer students into Oxbridge universities. Should we abolish private schools? Vince Cable.
Well, this is a terrible old chestnut. I remember this from well over half a century ago. And Labour governments that were a great deal more radical than the present Labour Party fought well shy of it, for good reason. I mean, this is a basic freedom of choice. It's almost certainly impractical if you be enormous cost. I mean, you cost the state would have to fund what people now provide privately. What would you do about people who tutor privately? Would that be abolished? It is in China, but we're not China. So, at what point do you draw the line between abolition and freedom? My definite answer is absolutely not. That many private schools are actually charities. They have a social obligation and they should fulfil it, and we should make sure that they fulfil it. But abolition is absolutely not the right way forward.
Emily.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of the charitable status, I think it's just abolition is just not really possible. I think that talking about just huge upheaval. But just in terms of whether, going back to will fewer students get into Oxbridge universities, the problem, there's a slight problem there, is that there is too many people from private schools getting into university. But also, some of these schools are now forced to take their charitable status much more seriously, which means they are taking children, and they've got bursaries, and they're being funded through the school system. Schools like Eton are doing this now, in a very, very big way. So does that mean if you've gone through a bursary, I'm just asking questions, because actually I don't know, and then you get into Oxford or Cambridge, are they going to say, well, no, you're from Eton, and even though you're a bursary, we're not going to let you in? I'm hoping they wouldn't.
I think they probably would.
But I do think that the Vice-Chancellor is right, that the balance between people arriving, being allowed in from state education, and those arriving from private is too much towards the private sector. But I think you also have to balance that we need to get people through our universities who are the best of the best, because that's good for the future of the country.
I think the problem that private schools are going to have very soon is that if Oxford and Cambridge aren't going to take the same proportions, you're going to get a lot of parents complaining, saying, hang on a minute, I've paid 30 grand a year to put my kid through your school, and my kid has got into what I regard as a second-rate university. I think that's a problem.
Lots of them are going to the States or European Union places like Maastricht.
Steve?
Look, I'd be concerned, where would you find your next Prime Minister if you abolish private schools?
Straight between the shoulder blades.
What is Boris, your 20th Etonian? Is that a meritocracy?
That is, no.
Look, I believe in choice, so I would not abolish private schools. But I do agree that there are a lot of talented kids from state schools who need an opportunity and don't get the leg up that kids from private schools do. So if you can find a way of equalising that, I'm all for it.
Denise?
If your objective in society is to make it fair and equal, then private schools are not part of that equation. They effectively generate elite types of individuals who move in certain directions in society, and the rest of the people who don't necessarily go to those places don't have the same opportunity. So, am I for choice? Yes. I actually went to a private school, but mine was a faith-based private school, primarily addressing the fact that black children were being basically coming through the system and we weren't getting any results. So I did benefit from it. But did I put my kids through one? No, I didn't. They went through the state school system. And I think if your objective is a fair society, private schools have no place.
Did you go to private school, Steve?
I went to a state school, as you could probably
Emily?
Private.
An old-fashioned grammar school.
So, interesting, the two women on the panel both went to a private school.
Yes.
Everyone can draw their own conclusions from that. Right. On another education subject, James in Hitchin is on the line. James, you've got a fascinating question. Go ahead.
Good evening. Yes, as many students go on study leave in the next few days for their GCSE and A-levels, does the panel have any tips, words of wisdom or inspiration for them to send them on their way?
So, exam techniques. Emily?
Oh gosh, I'm going to bring some personal experience in
Yeah,
here.
go on.
Don't get kicked out of school just
You didn't.
take your A-levels.
Really? Oh, come on.
Yes.
Spill.
No, I'm not saying why.
Oh, no, come
I
on.
did, but it's quite well documented, but I'm not going to repeat it. But it's not good. Let's just say it's not good.
Was it boys related?
It was a bit of everything. I was on a bit of a sort of thin line. I was studying very, very hard. I had a very nice Cambridge offer, and all I'm going to say is that I went home and studying by yourself. So this is my other tip: don't study by yourself. Because I was kicked out of school, I did go home, studied by myself. It was really bad, and I didn't get that. I didn't get that Cambridge thing. So find a study partner and behave. Don't get kicked out of school just before your exams.
I'm going to drag that out of you off air, or do a Google search.
Do a Google search.
Well, I guess the advice is don't cheat, because increasingly kids are being allowed to take their tablets and so on into exams, but I think the examiners have wised up to the fact that a lot of answers are coming straight out of Google, and so don't do it.
So don't cheat and don't get kicked out of school. How top that, Denise?
Okay, so the first 30 seconds, you breathe, count to 10, and then you do an exam plan for the questions. You look down, you look at the ones that you can answer first, and those are the ones you go for, and all the rest, you make a note and put what comes into your head. The whole process should take you 5 minutes, so that when you're further down in the exam, you have a guide.
Steve?
I actually agree with Denise there. Like, take a breath, read the question, let it soak in, and answer the question. And make sure you stick to your timelines. If you've got 40 minutes to answer that essay question, 40 minutes, not 35, not 47. Stick to your plan.
In my history A-level, I wrote 52 pages of A4. I just wrote everything I knew about every essay. I got a grade B. Thank you very much for asking, Vince.
Did you actually answer the question?
Well,
Or did you just regurgitate everything you knew?
So I must have done. But my problem was that I would always finish before everybody else. And
having written 52 pages?
I would still finish before anybody else in every single exam.
The examiners read it.
But I never got a grade A in anything I took an exam for, so that probably explains it. James, what's your own tip?
I think Denise should be a teacher. I like the idea of taking the time. Don't cram at the last minute. Spread out the revision. Work out how many days you've got between now and each exam, and spread it out.
Yeah, I agree with that. Don't revise until, 2 days before an exam. Finish it. If you don't know it then, you never will. And you'll be far more relaxed when you go into the exam. That's what I would say, but what do I know? Right, our final fun question from Maggie in Glasgow. Boris Johnson once said he wanted to be king of the world. If you had absolute authority as ruler of the world and you could do anything, what would be the first thing that you would change or do? Vince?
Well, I would hire a good team to run it. I mean, I think that there are too many people.
Are you a good delegator?
Not bad, yeah, but you do realise, I once had a vast empire when I was in government, literally millions of people depended on it ultimately, and you just have to learn to trust the people who run it. If you get a big head, you think you're running the world.
Even if you're in charge of the Home Office?
If you're in charge of the Home, you've got to delegate.
Steve?
Oh, well, front of my mind at the moment is Ukraine. So I would say release Alexei Navalny from prison and have a free and fair election in Russia.
Yes.
Very worthy. Not much fun, but very worthy. Denise?
I would eradicate hunger so that everyone had
You're not in
meal.
a beauty pageant.
No, but seriously, that's what I tried to do. I'd like everyone to have a decent meal, because from that, you can build many things if people are not hungry.
Emily?
I'm going on the fun side of this. Sorry. If I had absolute authority as the ruler of the world, I would make sure that Boris Johnson would never, ever, ever be allowed to be king of the world, because I think that'd be an absolute bloody disaster.
Take it you're not a fan.
No,
Okay, right. Well, it's been a very fun cross question. Slightly dodgy start when only 2 people were here, but we got through it. Steve Cannane, Denise Headley, Emily Sheffield and Vince Cable, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have more cross questions for you next week. Lots to discuss there. Now, in the next hour, we're going to talk about that imminent decision by the American Supreme Court on Roe versus Wade and try and translate that into this country. Should there be a debate on abortion law in this country? Should abortion laws be tightened? Should they be liberalised? Or do you think that our laws are just about right? Really want to hear your point of view. 0345 6060 973. I'm Iain Dale. This is LBC. It's 9 o'clock.
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Ukrainian officials say Russian forces have entered a steel plant in Mariupol where hundreds of people are sheltering. Some have been evacuated from the site in recent days, but many are thought to still be inside. There are reports of heavy fighting as well. Officials say they're still in contact with Ukrainian troops who are defending the factory. The country's Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, says he's remaining hopeful.
Mariupol is the most painful